On my channel, I've talked about so many watch brands' histories like Swatch, Tommy Hilfiger, Casio, even a little bit of HMT. But I've never really gotten into the history of watches themselves. And today, that is what the video is about. Now, just before we start, I want to make it clear that the history of watches is different than the history of timekeeping. The history of timekeeping starts with the sundial and all, but those are not considered watches. So the history of watches does not start with sundials. It is a bit different. The timepieces which could be worn were called watches. So that is where we'll start our history from. The first timepieces to be worn were built in 16th century in Germany, in the cities of Nuremberg and Augsburg, which were like a transition, as you could call it, between clocks and watches. These clock watches were worn around the neck or fastened to clothing. They were heavy drum-shaped cylinder brass boxes, several inches in diameter, engraved and ornamented. They only had an hour hand and they did not have any covering over the watch face like of glass or anything else. There was usually a hinged brass cover which had decorative grid work so that you didn't have to actually open the whole hinge to see the time and could just see it through the grills. And later in the century, there was a trend of weirdly shaped watches, like watches in the shape of a skull, animals, fruits, stars, etc. But these watches were not even worn to tell the time. The accuracy of these watches was so poor that you could not, rely on them to tell you the actual time. They would usually be off by, several hours in a day. They were practically useless, but they were worn as jewelry or novelty items by people. Now, from there, we move on to something that we are very familiar with, the concept of pocket watches. Styles changed in the 17th century and men began to wear watches in pockets instead of as pendants. But the women's watch remained as pendants till the 20th century. This said to have occurred in 1675 when Charles II of England introduced waistcoats. Now, these watches were not kept in pockets because it was just like a fashion statement or a fashion trend. This was actually done because those watches were very prone to damage due to the natural elements. So it was very important that they were kept safe in cases or in pockets. To fit in the pockets, their shape evolved into the typical pocket watch shape, rounded and flattened with no sharp edges. And finally, glass was used to cover the faces of these watches in 1610. Now, these watches weren't that accurate. They still had a little bit of faulty errors here and there. But with the introduction of a balance spring in 1657, watches saw a new dimension to accuracy. This tuned the balance wheel of the watch into a harmonic oscillator, thereby increasing the timekeeping accuracy to a great extent. So before this, watches had an error of several hours of a day, and this error was just reduced to about 10 minutes a day or so. It would not be wrong to say that this innovation paved the way for over 200 years of watchmaking innovation. Now we come to the more modern watch type thing, wristwatches. From the beginning, wristwatches were almost exclusively only worn by women, while men used the pocket watches until the 20th century. But the concept of the wristwatch goes back to the production of the very earliest watches in the 16th century. By the mid 19th century, most watchmakers produced a range of wristwatches, often marketed as bracelets for women. Founded in 1832, Longines was the world's first watch trademark and the first Swiss company to assemble watches under one roof. Watches were first worn by military men towards the end of the 19th century. This was first started by military men because they had to synchronize their attacks on the enemy and they didn't want to do it in a way that could expose them to the enemy, by typical ways like a smoke bomb or a shout maybe. If they did that, the enemy would know that the attack was coming. So they needed a wristwatch to make sure that all of them were synchronized to attack at the same time. And also, it was very clear that if a soldier is on a horse or something, it is very inconvenient and impractical for them to reach into their pocket, pull out their pocket watch, read the time, and then keep it back. It would be very difficult to do that in the midst of a war. So, a wristwatch also made it even more convenient for them to see the time. Also, in 1876, the first international watch precision contest was held in Philadelphia. And by the 1900, the accuracy of the watch had improved so much that it was just making errors of about a few seconds in a day. Yuri Gagarin, the Soviet pilot, became the first human to travel to space, and when he did venture out on the Vostok 1, he wore a wristwatch. This was the first time someone had reached space wearing a wristwatch. And in 1950s is when electric powered watches hit the scene. The balance spring in these watches was powered by a solenoid. And on the Christmas of 1969, quartz watches hit the market for the first time. This was by far the most accurate wristwatch. And the introduction of these watches also led to what is known as the quartz crisis in around the 1980s. I have made a video on the quartz crisis, well, not specifically, but it is included and is a big part of my video on the brand Swatch. So if you do want to know more about that, go check out that video. The first solar powered watch was built in 1972 and named the Synchronar 2100, stemming from synchronous chronometer calendar. The first radio controlled watches came into the scene in 1990. These watches match the accuracy of atomic clocks. Atomic clocks are types of clock that use certain resonance frequencies of atoms to keep time with extreme accuracy. In 2013, we witnessed the first atomic wristwatch, which was basically using the same principles as an atomic clock but in the form of a wristwatch. This watch had an accuracy of 1 second in 1,000 years. The world's first smartwatch was released in 1998. This watch could run applications and connect to a PC through a docking station. So this was the history of watches as a whole, and some people say that watches are going to become obsolete, that there won't be a utility or need for them anymore, but I don't think so. Because there will always be someone who wants a watch, maybe because of the inner workings and the engineering and the watchmaking that has gone into it, the amount of skill that has gone into it. Or some people must be there who just like the feel on the wrist, who just like to use it as an accessory or as somewhat of an aesthetics. But I feel like watches are always here to stay. But it really is interesting to see how watches were, first something of a novelty and just a showpiece which couldn't even tell the time accurately, to now where they are actually being used to tell the time, and how the accuracy of them has improved over the years at such immense levels. So that was the history of watches. I hope you liked the video. Thank you so much for watching and stay tuned for more.